I think indeed we need to keep witness. We need to keep witness of these issues, because as Hisham said, what we have is a regime that actually wants to rewrite history, and the honest truth, was really left of Libya are those of us who are outside. Inside, Libyans have in fact been reprogrammed, totally reprogrammed, and they depend on us for their history. They depend on us for their language. And so it's very important that it's incumbent upon us who are outside to actually write Libyan history and remind them of what they were, remind them of what they are, and that they should never accept this type of behavior at any cost. So I'm really happy to see that taking place right now.
Sir.
I have to start by making an apology to every Libyan because I'm Egyptian. What Nasser said to Gaddafi in 1970, just before he died, to remind me of my youth, was exactly the reason why you guys are suffering. So, my apologies. I really apologize.
That's a huge
I have a soft spot for Libya. I've lived there for 4 years when I was a kid, and I loved it. I loved the honesty of Libyans, which I suspect is no longer the case, because the regime has such a corrupting influence on how Libyans themselves have developed. But your point about revising history reminds me of a very funny thing that happened back in Egypt. I'm sure they picked up something on that in Libya. In all the Egyptian movies, when the coup d'etat happened in 1952, which they called the revolution, we had movies from 30 or 40 years back before the revolution. And some of these movies would carry the picture of King Farouk in the background. So they issued instructions to blot out the picture of King Farouk, and you would see this moving little black thing. And instead of just passing by without anybody noticing, it was as if they were telling everybody, "This is King Farouk. What is this?" So, yeah, there is the revisionist history on the part of the revolution. But my question to all of you, and feel free not to answer it. The only thing I find common among the countries of the Arab world, and I take your point that Congo is terrible, and there are a couple of other places that may have seen worse fate being an Arab. But the only thing I find in common among the Arabs, other than Arabic, is Islam. Do you think this is contributing to this perpetuation of dictatorship from the Gulf all the way to the Atlantic?
No.
No,
I mean, I think also
the truth is many of those regimes find Islam, okay, a direct opposition to what they do. I mean, here, Gaddafi, the first thing he did was actually to fight the Islamists. He eliminated all vestiges of Islamists within Libya itself, because he sees them as musha'wideen. Islam, for him, is what conforms to his own view of the world. That's what Islam is to him. So, the first thing he says, well, we will no longer accept the traditional dates of Islam, the calendar, the calendar itself. He changed the Islamic calendar. He says, well, Muhammad was wrong, that he didn't say, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. No, قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. So he wants to change the Quran as well too. So for him, the ego is so huge that he sees himself not only as a prophet, he sees himself more than that. And so he will not tolerate religion. I wouldn't even bring this as right. No, don't bring Islam in this matter. We don't.
If I may say, I think the question of Islam, and is this the only thing in our world, is a tricky one. And I think we shouldn't be... yeah, sure. I think the current crisis and the frustration that permeates the Arab world shouldn't blind us to see the larger context. It's easy to see in this time of crisis a quick answer for things. And I try to, that's the lesson I learned from the colonial period, is not to quickly find a quick answer for it. Sometimes that might be satisfactory, give you a quick answer, but also the problem will persist. I think when it comes to Islam, I think this is really a common religion in general, and Islam specifically is the fabric that permeates social and moral life in the region. But Islam also being appropriated by the states, Islam also of all varieties being nationalized by new groups that emerged in the last 30 or 40 years. So the idea to talk about Islam as sometimes we talk about it in the United States is really troubling to me, because there is a search for a quick answer, and the quick answer is easy to find, but it's not going to resolve challenges that are social and contemporary, whether that of Islamic movements challenging the states or states appropriating and using Islam for its own ends. And this is really an area where I find a big flaw in the literature on Islam, because everybody talks about Islam. People who think that they were born Muslim, they can't talk about Islam. People who read 10 books or 20 books, they can write about Islam. So it becomes really the original sin that everybody wants to find. And I think I find it could be a block to understand the larger issues beyond the people's belief in their faith and their moral guidance.
I actually meant the separation of religion and the state. I mean, I didn't mean Islam as a regressive factor, as Islam itself. I meant the use of regimes of Islam. I'm sure in Libya, like Mansour said, that is not the case because Gaddafi is against that. But I meant that if you took religion out of the equation completely, and correct me, I mean, the only viable opposition in Libya, if the army was taken out, would be some kind of religious opposition.
Oh yeah, the Islamists. And you must understand, the democratic opposition is always very easy to remove because it's very apparent, it's open. Okay, so what you find? You find that opposition that is not open. And unfortunately, in this case, the Islamists tend to be the closed opposition. But even there, Gaddafi uses them to actually silence all other movements, and he has done it many times. Now, besides the other factor, which is really very important, that Libya's Islam is a very benign form. It has always been so. Okay. It really is not. I mean, to compare Libya to Saudi Arabia or Iran, it's nonsensical. You can't even compare it to Egypt. Egypt is more Muslim in that sense than even Libya. Libya's Islam is very benign. It's very instinctive in a sense. There's a mixture of Islam and traditions and some Sufism, by the nature of Libya is like that. And so it plays an important role. I'm not saying no. Islam is very important in Libyan life, but not in the sense that is hegemonic in determining the system. It's not. I mean, it serves as a censorship for individuals. It's very powerful censorship, what is right and what is wrong. And the regime uses that very cleverly and very, very smartly, okay, to maintain the edge in what they want to do.
Do you have a question?
Yes, actually. I think we can, pull out a few common themes from all of our panelists. And we've talked about brutality. We've talked about oppression. I mean, it was present during the period of colonization, and these constant shocks. They keep continuing. So I wonder if anyone would like to comment on this issue of continuity and this constant state of exception.
Hisham?
That's a very, very smart question.
It's a very, very smart question.
And it's, so I won't answer it. But I will say this, though. I will say that the view that, what Mansour said earlier, the view that intellectual capital and any agency for progress and change in Libya is, if I understood you correctly, that it's sort of held by Libyans abroad, and that the Libyans there are basically exhausted and bankrupt intellectually. I resist that because I think certainly Libya has lost a lot of its people to exile, but I remain an optimist. You know, there are so many signs. The thing about dictatorship is that it's got all the agencies for self-destruction are implanted in it. You know, dictatorships by and large don't last as long as democracies do, and so I think it's just that is one reason why I'm optimistic. But the other reason why I'm optimistic is that I can see all these young writers in Libya publishing, doing, writing in journals, blogging, which has become a phenomenon. Yes, the writing isn't, great, but there's a real hunger for expression, for recording life. There's, this dignity to be had in stating the present in language. And that's sort of, all those reasons give me optimism. Libya is, yes, way behind, and it's a tragic state of affairs. But there's still that thing that can never be destroyed by any dictator, I believe, that is growing and is so those are my very weak reasons for being an optimist. So someone else now to answer this clever question.
Yeah, I think this is a very, very tough question and a good one. There are certain facts that we need to know about modern Libya in the 20th century, which is, I think, for example, up until 1930s, what we might call civil society or society has been always stronger than the state. Libya, until the 20th century, has been dominated by rural forces, not urban forces. I think Libyans, after they went through the brutal colonization, they faced the 20th century with a federal constitutional monarchy that was modernizing. But at the same time, I think the fact that the central state has been recent, Libyan society, more than Libyan culture, that will be really a cliche to say, in my opinion, has been really reluctant in dealing with the modern nation state. And that could be a problem, could be an interesting challenge. Italian colonialism failed. If we compare it with the fact that the French created an elite, Francophone elite, people in the other Maghrebi states, and also in Egypt, I would say, segment of the Egyptian elite has been also socialized to look at Europe in that way. But in some sense, Libyan society has not really, and that problem is acute now after '69, is to accept the nation state and to continue the building and the modernizing process that started after 1951. And what kind of state is going to be erected there? Or to build an indigenous institutions and mix it with modern institutions. So in that sense, I think modern Libya, despite the tragedies, to me is a very interesting society, because when the society has been strong up until the 1930s, and from 1951 until 1969, it managed to create something really that a weaker state actually might be a positive thing. That's maybe one of the lessons that we learned now, that society, when crushed and nationalized, it will lead to consequences that are unintended. Now, the lessons of the last 40, 50 years is something very different. Lisa wrote about the disruption about institution between 19th century and 20th century in her earlier work. And this disruption or the discontinuity really has been a heavy harvest for Libyan people. because every time there's a change, there will be eradication of the earlier institutions. The Italian destroyed the Ottoman institution, the Senussi institutions, and then after 1969, the destruction of the earlier institutions. And I think in a sense that added to the crisis that's there. But I'm up to a pessimist here, because history gives you lessons to go backward and sometimes lessons to go forward. And the Libyan experience, even when it's really acute, I think in those indigenous institutions and the tenacious ability to Libyan to be healthily suspicious of the central government might be revived next time. That's not going to be easy, because that's going to take a lot of work before you kind of revive these traditions that existed before. In other words, I see a lot of complexity, a lot of potentials, but it's not an easy, quick answer.
No, I was once a participant in some, I don't know, in Washington, D.C., some think tank. And somebody asked me something about the possibility of a coup against Gaddafi, a popular uprising. And I said, well, might be. Look what's happening in Serbia. And the man said, well, are you comparing the Libyans to the Serbs? And I said, yes. He says, well, you can't. And I took offense at it. But to think back is right. I mean, what society has been going through 40 years and nothing has changed in it. The big problem here, and I think he touched upon that, is that civil society was never given time to develop. I mean, you look. I mean, and we can see it very clearly in the type of colonialism. The British, when they occupied a society, whether it's India or Nigeria or Sudan, they dealt with those societies through institutions. And so, even if you have a problem in Nigeria, but suddenly they have a parliament, they have some sort of institutional framework which they can revert to, they can go back to. Same thing with India. We tend to forget that India is the largest democracy in the world. Partly thanks to the British, partly thanks to the British for doing that, for establishing institutions. The British never intermarried or involved themselves in the societies they occupied, per se. They dealt through institutions. The French, on the other hand, didn't really care as long as you ate French, spoke French, led French. They would go to a society, pick up a small tribe, Christianize it, and put it in power. Okay? And this Francophonic Africa is like that, whether it's Chad, whether it's Niger, whatever it is. Okay, that's a problem. The Spaniards basically gave you the choice: either become Spanish or die. And we saw it over here. Yeah. Italians did not even give the Libyans that choice. And that thing, what you saw up there, was very clear. They ultimately, I mean, we talk about the decimation of the population. Yes, the Italians were intent upon decimating the Libyan population. They were superfluous. Libya was the fourth shore. The institution they created was not for the benefit of Libyans. It was for the benefit of Italians. And hence, we never really saw the development of civil society in Libya. In the very few years we saw that, from 1951 onwards, in 1969, we saw the emergence of that. We saw literary clubs, we saw formation of political parties, we saw a variety of institutions that we never had before. We saw unions coming up. We saw the beginning of civil society. But it was aborted. Aborted, okay, fine, aborted. But put something else instead. So you find a huge vacuum that has been going on for the last 40 years and not being filled. You talk about change. He decided last week that he wants to change the currency again. So now the Libyan currency is twice, now the third time. This year, anyone who has money, old money, now is useless unless they bring it and put it in the bank for him. It's this constant shifting, this constant inability to develop the civil society, because ultimately only civil society can in fact hold the government accountable. In France today, you have demonstrations by fuel loaders, you find farmers, you find all kinds of groups within society come and says, no, we don't want that. Libyan society, those groups never evolved, never developed. That was a conscious policy. And therefore, this is why I'm not optimistic about this. I'm not optimistic, but I've seen it the last 40 years. It makes it, I worry. I worry about the next generation of Libyans. I've taken too long, I'm sorry. Hog things tend to do that.
Let me just point out, of course, the Italians were in control, such as it was, of Libya for 30 years, and Gaddafi's been in control of Libya for 40 years. So it's just, and I think I also want to sort of open another issue that I will leave it to you to follow up on if you're interested. Hisham talked a little bit about the edible issues in Libya. Of course, we have at least one and perhaps 2 or 3 sons of Gaddafi who are considered plausible successors to him. And I think one of the interesting things we might be wanting to talk about a little bit is the prospect for any of those and the issue that that raises about continuity and change. Because, of course, Saif al-Islam, for example, says that he thinks that there should be a constitution in Libya. And he is very much associated with institution building kind of project in Libya, and yet, of course, represents some of the uninstitutionalized elements of the current regime. And so that tension is very much, your question, it seems to me, is very much related to that. What constitutes continuity and what constitutes change in a circumstance where what has been continuous has been change?
Well, if I may add to that, I would just say that several months ago there was probably an article in the newspapers where it was discussed that Saif's youth councils would replace the revolutionary committees. I'm not sure if any of you came across that, but I thought I might interject that.
That'd be good.
Neil.
Well, I sort of want to ask a practical question on that level. You said, that you had 40 years of malignancy and marked basically by idiosyncrasy, and the only thing that's going to change that is Gaddafi stepping down. And the only way he's probably going to step down is if he stepped into the grave. So is there any sign of that? And then what happens next? Do the children compete? And safe statements are all well and good, but we've seen the same process in Syria and in Jordan and Bahrain and Morocco, where they all come in and they talk about democracy, but it requires taking part what their fathers built, and they refuse to do that. So
Yes.
I mean, you've had an incredibly engaging conversation about the past and the present, but if you could look at the topic of
just again, begging. If I beg for just 1 second, let's look at just a little bit more on the past. I have not. In my life, I have not seen any Arab leader. I've seen only 2 Arab leaders resign willingly. Okay, the rest were carried out. But with the grave. Quite right. Okay, one was from Sudan, and the other one was Algeria. Okay.
Nasser.
Huh?
And Nasser resigned. He was raised by the people.
The people.
Yes.
Nasser.
After 67 war.
Oh, Nasser. Oh, yeah. Oh, sure. Okay, it's fine. Okay, no. Sorry.
2 hours.
Okay, it's about 2.
Suwar al-Dhahab, yeah.
Suwar al-Dhahab.
Yes.
Okay, and Shadli bin Jadid.
Yes.
Sort of.
It was forced.
Yeah, no, that doesn't count.
Doesn't count.
So what did that?
Suwar al-Dhahab. Okay, one. That makes it worse. Okay,
Lebanese president.
But Lebanon is different.
Lebanon, there's no state. Okay.
But there is election.
There's
Yeah.
election. What I'm saying, it is a dilemma. Look at the world today. The world today, so much is going on across the world. Perhaps the most stable part of the world is the Middle East. Have you ever seen more stability than you see in the Middle East? Nowhere else. Okay. So the question arises, who's to Gaddafi? Yes, Gaddafi has children. Okay. Now, do they really deserve to be? Well, perhaps, yes. But the system will be tailored very much like Syria. Here again, it's a fascinating study into the personality of leadership within Libya. Here's a man who had a coup against what he perceived to be as backwardness in the form of monarchies. He went lots of Libya's money and effort and lives were spent in fighting, whether it's Morocco or fighting Jordan or fighting whatever it is. Okay? And they wanted neither east nor west as far as monarchies were concerned. And yet, what does he end up being? He wants to make himself a king, a monarch. Okay. The irony in all of this is that not only does he do what contradicts what he has always been saying, but he finds justification to do the contradiction. Is he going to leave one of his children in power? Yes. Which of the children will be in power? I think, my personal opinion, I think it would be safe. But he understands something which is another element which has not been talked about. The billions of dollars that he has at his disposal. What do the others want? The question. There is no accountability in Libya. When his second son, second son from the second wife, Saadi, decides that he wants to sign a $25 billion deal with an Emirati company to build chalets somewhere in western Tripoli. Okay. Did he ask anyone? Was there a parliament? Was there anyone who said, yes, you can do that? No. I mean, all of this is show. What you see in the formal institutions that he has. So this shows they have no power. Safe? And here you think that there's a person who has studied, has lived in Europe, who has studied in the London School of Economics, who understands what democracy, has lived the fruits of democracy, he understands what participation means, and yet, what does he want to do? He pays it lip service. In the final analysis, he likes what his father has done. And he will continue what his father is doing. He will not change.
I actually, if I may, want to complicate that a little bit. Because I think there is an interesting dilemma confronting someone in Saif's position. Because he's in his position, because of course he is the leader's son. But he is also one of the few people his age who is in fact fluent in English, yes, is educated in Europe, knows something about the way the rest of the world works. This was a country under deep, deep sanction. We didn't talk about that. We talked about the Italians, we talked about the revolution, but we didn't talk about the effect of the sanctions. And the sanctions were very corrosive. So it's partly the revolution and it's partly the sanctions. But the fact that Libya went under sanction and on the eve of one of the great technological revolutions of human history, at a time so that, from the time I got email to the time I got my smartphone, they basically weren't there. There were no credit cards. There was no nothing. So that generation of Libyans has been playing catch-up. Now, quickly and, all that sort of stuff. But it does mean that Saif has had a window onto the world that is quite unusual for that generation of Libyans. So it means that he has an opportunity, because of the fortune that he had in being not only his father's son, but taken under the wing of people who would take him to Vienna and have him go to business school and then help him get into LSE and, the life that he led, so that now he's, a student of David Held and, so it's an interesting challenge for him. He understands the position he plays in the country, the fortune he has had, if you will. He does know what institutions are. He does know there is a single institution in Libya. And there is this interesting moment where a figure like that, and it is true that there isn't, none of this generation of people who have succeeded their father has done anything particularly remarkable in that. But everybody, the optimists, the genuine, sort of completely Pollyanna optimists, look at King Juan Carlos. How do you get from fascism in Spain, from Franco, to democracy? You have a pivotal figure who comes up as the picked heir of Franco. Franco picked that man and said, he's going to succeed me. He's the one who's going to continue fascism. And as soon as Franco was dead and as soon as Juan Carlos was king, he said, no, this is a democracy. This is stupid. So the question of what made Spain Spain and made Syria Syria, so that somebody with the, cosmopolitan, educated in England, so forth and so on, Bashar Assad ends up being captured by his father's system. And King Juan Carlos didn't.
Civil society.
Well,
And family.
It's about civil society.
I think it is. Spain had an industrial
It's a
base, a
base-
civil society, so
That's
forth
right.
and so on, that made it much more
Easy,
plausible.
put the pressure on the
Absolutely,
regime. That's right.
absolutely.
And also, I think it was, I think a lot of what happened in Spain happened because it is in a continent that wouldn't have tolerated
Absolutely.
it.
The Europeans
And
paid through the nose for that democracy.
Yeah, they did.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
don't forget, not only Spain,
but also
not only Spain, but Chile too. I mean, come back. Chile under Pinochet was a fascist dictatorship. But what made the change? What brought about? What ended Chile's rule? And now we have a democracy in Chile.
I think also means something else to say about people like SAFE, or taking them at face value, what they say, and looking at their experience and what they were exposed to and all that. I think one gets the sense that a lot of people who want to make things different in Libya and who are in some way implicated or involved with the regime are also tired and frustrated by the idiosyncrasy and the absurdity of the dictatorship. I'll give you an example. What is the number one demand, the number one Libyan demand from the British government? Is it international respectability through doing these projects, or all these kind of obvious things, completely counterintuitive? The number one demand that the Libyan government has asked the British government for is Gaddafi dressed up to the nines in his military uniform in the golden wagon going up Pall Mall to visit the Queen. And this kind of articulates a kind of the depth of absurdity, and also kind of just daily life of a Libyan bureaucrat is not actually very attractive. They might have, they might have the advantages of being able to send their kids abroad, and they might have the advantages of luxury and money and security and things like that. But I don't have the impression that they are happy or that they are content with the situation. And this kind of, these two extremes where the dictatorship becomes more and more and more idiosyncratic and absurd, and the people supporting it have more and more access to the world and sending their kids abroad. And I think eventually there'll be a critical point where one hopes that these forces of change would be allowed a chance, and it might not work. But I think I think also something else to say about the examples given about Syria and Morocco and so on. I'm not as negative about them as I think my fellow panelists are. It's obviously not an ideal state of affairs that one dictator is replaced by another dictator who happens to be his son, because it gives us sort of a sense of infinity, like this could go on forever. But there are some serious changes that have happened, particularly in Morocco, I think, that I think should be the envy of a lot of Arabic countries. The fact that there still remains political prisoners in Morocco, of course, I know that. But no other Arabic country closed political prisons in such a public way, following the Truth and Reconciliation. I know it's highly imperfect, but they tried to do it, and they went some way into doing it. They have school trips for children to Hadramaut and such, sort of hideous places, and so, it's not ideal, but I think looking, the long view, it's very difficult to imagine Morocco going back to what it was. And I think in another 100 years, of course, we want an immediate kind of sunshine, but it's not going to happen. I think it's going to be a long process. So having somebody like Saif replace Gaddafi will be, break many people's hearts, but including mine. But I think it is moving given the options that we have, it's moving in the right direction. Because obviously the other silent option is a military general who is plotting away in the dark and throws everything over, and we have another, military dictatorship with
I'm going to put my 3 cents in here. First of all, I think Saif's problem, because he is his father's son in some respects, is that it's not clear whether his enthusiasm for reform and for constitutionalism and so forth and so on is another idiosyncratic folly or legit. And that's just a very hard position to be in. I mean, it's... so that's one thing. The other thing is, I actually think the alternative is not a Boumediene, not a military dictator, but coming apart at the seams. I actually think that Libya does run the risk of basically a low-level civil war.
Civil war.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's another reason to say, you know what? Keeping the thing together might be better than not. And I think that's the...
Yes, and I totally agree with you. I think Libya today is a fuse that ultimately Gaddafi goes, you'll have a civil war. And a civil war that will see half of the population murdered. That is, and I have no doubt about that. You're right.
Can I say a quick comment here? I think the difficulty of the post-Gaddafi Libya has to do with the fact the system, even though it's part of the Arab system in many ways, and it will be really important to keep that in mind, is that there is no clear vision or constitutional or political process that indicate what's going to happen after the leader dies or whatever happens to him. And also the system has been for the last 20 years or 30 years or so, and I'm glad that Lisa brought the question of the sanctions because it has horrendous impact in many ways. Informal institutions has become really the way. And this is, in Syria you have a political party, whatever that nature, you have a bureaucracy. In Morocco you have a monarchy. And I think those institutions have a mechanism to resolve some of these issues of succession. In Libya it's going to be complicated. Because so far, even after Colonel Gaddafi's statement, and he tried to appoint his son Saif al-Islam as منسق اللجان القيادات الشعبية or coordinator for the
Revolutionary Committee.
Not Revolutionary Committee, no.
The People's
Committees, yes.
People's Committees.
Yeah, so that kind of fizzled a little bit, and that's the nature of the difficulties. But I would like to steer our attention a little bit different. I think the question of leadership is huge, and Mansour has every right to highlight that. I think what we sometimes overlook is the changes within Libyan society. For example, there is a genuine movements among intellectuals, academics, human rights organizations now, pushing for reform from within. And we don't hear about them because we don't have access to Arabic. I know some of them. I participated in some of these conferences recently, and they really are people who are lobbying, and they're confronting other groups like the revolutionary committees and other groups. And I would say that Saif is probably, we're right to look at him within the larger picture of the leadership in the top. But there is also a segment of Libyan society that is pushing for change. And they sometimes being suppressed, sometimes they're kind of silenced. They have this newspaper, they have this journal, and they come. And can I say also, one of the most overlooked things is the thriving Libyan literature, the short stories writers, the poets, the women of writing that's in Arabic. And I think what all they tell us is not a romantic idea, but that there is now society generating its own voices. Yes, it's sometimes quiet, sometimes cannot really be daring, but these are forces are really trying to advocate, fight corruption, try to advocate the idea of rule of law, trying to push for freedom of press, for example. That's a big fight now in Libya. That newspapers, journals, pushing for to allow groups to be represented and have their own voices. The fight over, for example, the Lawyers Guild or the Writers Union. That's incredible fight. The fight over the presidency of Benghazi University, which I know. There are all, and people are blogging and trying to express themselves. I'm not talking about the exile. That's a different story. I think within Libyan society, there are a lot of groups that in so many ways trying to confront the harvest.
But the truth is the good tries, but nothing concrete is. You see that because the regime does not allow these groups to actually participate or be active. They and when it emerges, they cut it off. What newspaper do you see set up by anything beside the regime?
They are. For example, Oya and Qurina began to quietly express some opinions. For example, their experience of Arajin, which most of its writers were from Libya, published in Cairo. But I think it's incredible.
Yeah, it's published in Cairo, published in
but distributed in Libya.
I understand, but it might be very much like the Islamic countries when they want to hold a conference. They don't hold it in Islamic country; they hold it in Cyprus.
No, Mansour. But Mansour, I think it's understand. We have to look at those voices in context. They might not be as able to express themselves, but there is now a genuine fight about, for example, the civil society. The Revolutionary Committee say there is no such thing. This is a Western invention. And the other groups are replying to them. They say, no, there is a civil society. We're going to fight for it. And I think these are not just chaotic or marginal debates. These are, I think, important fights, maybe small ones. There's an American social scientist whom I admire very much. He has a book called Hidden Transcript. He talks about the public transcript and the hidden transcript for the dominated people. I think you find a lot of hidden transcript in Libya now. And these things might be really crucial, maybe advocating, as we were talking, maybe supporting civil Islam for all kind of reasonable reasons, or other groups. But we'll make a mistake of overlooking those groups that might not be visible to us.
Okay.
Very
quickly.
Very quickly. I'll look at that. Lisa made a very good point, and the good point is that the economic suicide from 1978 to 2004. Yeah. But in that period of time, the world has changed dramatically. We have the iPhone, iBook, and iPhone, and we have so much that the country can't afford to be walking in eggs. Yeah. It can't do it. And Saif al-Islam is not providing an alternative. Indeed, he's following in the same footsteps. I mean, when you talk about the Gaddafi Foundation, it's an NGO. What NGO? Tell me an NGO that's sanctioned by the government in Libya.
It's actually chartered in Switzerland.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
It's not a historical question, actually. We think back on the period, the monarchy period, and then the coup that took place, the darkest coup. I have two questions. What explains the success of the coup? Why was the coup so successful? And then what explains the persistence of the regime? What are the causes of that? Why has the regime been so successful at continuing to hold on to power? What is the social base of the regime in Libya? Who supports the regime?
I thought this was a small question.
A huge question.
Ideally, it would be. It would be a small question.
There's no way.
That's the biggest question of all. Let me say a few things about it, and I'll let my colleagues comment on this. It's not true that in 1969 it was an isolated coup. It's not true. The junior officers who toppled the modernizing constitutional monarchy in Libya were very popular at the beginning. And that's the danger of reading history in projecting history in the past. Now, what happened since the mid-70s on, there were a lot of changes among the group that did the coup or the revolution, whatever you want to call it. And then after that, a new regime began to rise and led to the things that Mansour wrote about and others, which led to other kind of changes within Libyan society and politics. I think now also it's very, very conducive to look at why some Libyan youth were radicalized in the 1960s, as why some of Libyan youth began to radicalize in the 1980s. Earlier it became nationalism, Muslim Brothers, and also leftist affiliations. And in the 1980s, Islamic movements and other groups who began to confront the state. I think only by looking at these really specific contexts, we can understand it. And we understand the rhetoric of nationalism. I happen to argue, it's a very controversial argument, earlier, part of the legitimacy of the officers was the delayed, repressed nationalism. And military bases and all of that. That's up to a point. Then after that, it became a new security apparatus, a new state, a new leadership that became in control of the state and became a war against its enemies. Either you are with me or against me.
0-0 game. They don't.
Yeah.
So, with me or against me.
Yeah. But I think your question is really very, very insightful in the sense we have to really look at the context and what period and what change. That will help us understand what goes on then in the 1970s and the 80s and after the Lockerbie crisis.
Can I just say one or two things about this very good question, very large question? First of all, keep in mind that at the time when Gaddafi came to power, there were half a dozen coups in the making, some of which were supported by the Egyptians and some of which were supported by the Americans and so forth. These guys just got there first. So it wasn't as if that was a very stable, well-regarded regime. Monarchy was obviously going to fall over, and it just was a question of who got there. So when we talk about institutions, we should not romanticize the monarchy. There were no institutions there either. So, and this is part of the 20th century. There were, in my view, institutions in 1910, and that was about the last time, because the Italians did everything they could to destroy the institutional design and makeup of the country. The British and French did nothing to rebuild it when they were the occupiers during the war. The monarchy was unable to do that, and the oil money swamped whatever efforts they may have been able to make. And so this is the 20th century. We're finished now. But that's part of the problem. So that's one point about that. The other thing is that I think what's interesting is we have several times, all of us in different ways, said the fact that Gaddafi's been in power for 40 years doesn't mean that it's been 40 same years. There's been different, quite distinct periods within that 40 years. And it's important to acknowledge, in a sense, that one of the ways he stayed in power is to recognize that. I mean, he himself was the engineer of some of those changes. So a regime that came in the 1970s, very, very opposed to tribalism, ends up in the 1990s completely turning around on. So it's a very different regime. So in a sense, it is true that internationally it was a pariah, and now it's, everybody's welcomed it back. But domestically, there was that kind of change over the course of time that was in fact, we have to credit that regime for having been as flexible and inventive to stay in power under those circumstances. The one other thing, though, I want to say is, if you want a really elegant illustration of how the radicalization of a regime can kind of sneak up on you, read this. Read In the Country of Men. You watch. It was sneaking up on people. In the end of the 1970s, people who had been, young people particularly, very excited about this new young group of, nationalists, and they'd overthrown this embarrassing monarchy, and now Libya was something in the world, and so forth and so on. It snuck up on everybody how bizarre and off the rails this system was getting. And that period is particularly interesting in my view for that.
If I may, in 1978, I was walking down in Benghazi, and there was a demonstration. University students were demonstrating in the streets. And one of the kids looked at me, and I feel so ashamed because I didn't join him. Then looked at me and says to me, "Join me. Tomorrow he'll come for you." And I looked at him, bewildered. And true enough, 2 years later, I was coming down from my home, and the traffic was pushed in one direction, and I had to follow that direction. And it took me before a square, where I saw two people being strung up. And the first thing that came to my mind was that kid who said to me, "Join me. Tomorrow they'll come for you."
Can I just say one thing in response to your question, Bashir? I think also, one of the reasons for the regime's success, it's sort of its genius, actually. I think it lies at the heart of its ability to change and to remain in power, is that it doesn't have a consistent political ideology. It's not on the left, it's not on the right. Sometimes it's on the left. Sometimes we were told to look towards Cuba, and then suddenly we're told to look towards Abu Dhabi. It's sort of very, and that's made it very agile and inflicted on the Libyan population a kind of constant anxiety, because nothing is permanent. Everything's changing all the time. And I think another way, particularly in those early years, in the 70s and also in the 80s, the Gaddafi regime, it was obvious that they could have killed more people than they killed. But they had taken a decision, I think, to kill as few people as possible, but in the most dramatic way as possible. So in squares, on television, and so on. And that really did send the shivers, anecdotally, there are many people I know in Libya who, I have one of my many cousins lives full time in England, and he's a medical doctor. And as it happened, at some point we lived in the same place. We still lived in the same area. We were probably about a 3-minute walk from one another. And until this day, I can't get him to have a cup of tea with me. Not because he disagrees with me, but because he's scared, he's frightened. And a lot of Libyans continue to have this kind of almost kind of instinctive fear. It's so irrational. It's sort of absurd, actually, that you should be scared of. But the regime succeeded in doing this in a very effective way and in a very modern way by using television.
If I'm allowed one, what's the
Follow-up.
Is it possible to argue that the stability and the persistence of the regime, its success, if you like, is related to its control of resources and living? The fact that the way the regime makes a living, as it were, has very little to do with actively exploiting the population. And it just lives off its control of oil. And that gives you a high level of independence from the society. You don't need it. The society is completely dispensable. In that way, it's very similar to Saudi Arabia.
I guess we forgot to say that part, yes.
No, but also it doesn't fall under the influence of, Libya is unique in this regard. It doesn't need handouts. It doesn't fall under the influence of its ex-colonial master. But also I think Gaddafi's success, in being internationally influential comes from one of the reasons I think that Libya in general was keen on this sort of thing at that time. It's kind of dreams of grandeur. You know, a small South Mediterranean country with very few people, you know, wants to punch above its weight. And Gaddafi succeeded in doing that by funding, you know, by basically being a troublemaker for the West for a long time. That now he can negotiate, and he can have this kind of, you know, stature with them and leverage with them.
Yusuf, do you?
Just one thing. I was just hoping if we could consider Libya's relationship with other states, particularly the United States and Europe. I mean, as Libya has gone through its fluctuations, so has its relationship with the West. If any of you would like to comment on that.
May I? Would you just-
No, go ahead.
No, go back to slide.
Okay, I will then.
I'll follow up on you.
No, the interesting thing to me about the ultimate negotiations to lift the sanctions and so forth and so on was the extent to which, particularly the United States, was put into a position where they did drop the demand for regime change, which the sanctions were designed to produce, and the American sanctions were not supposed to be lifted until there was a change in the regime. And again, I think this is the fact that the regime has been able to negotiate through all of this and stay in power is a credit to its agility and, you know, kind of political savvy and lack of ideological consistency. But it was, you know, in the late Clinton period when Saif al-Islam convinced his father, and his father wouldn't listen to anybody else, that if he wanted to have any kind of legacy, he was going to have to wriggle out of the sanction regime under which the country was laboring at that point. And thanks largely to September 11th, they were able to produce enough interesting information and material for the British and the United States to accomplish that. But so in that sense, it is really ultimately about the stability of the regime, and so the policy changes, and the regime is the consistent thread all the way through.
But America has demonstrated that it is willing to resort to force if it feels that its security and its resources and its access to resources are threatened. Why has that not been the case, for example, as it has been with countless other Arab or Latin American countries? Why has that not been the case with Libya?
Alternatives. Libya is an alternative to Libya. It will cost much more in terms of, first of all, military offensive, America's position in the world, and so forth. Doesn't need to. As long as there are alternatives to what we have today, why not? America gets 5% of oil from the Middle East, no more. Don't forget that. Much of its oil does not come from the Middle East. It comes from Latin America, from Mexico, it comes from Canada, it comes from the United States as well. In Africa, it comes from Angola. Okay? That's what Nigeria. This is where this all comes from. It's more trouble than it's worth. But again, just to answer the question which you asked, and I think this is very important. I mean, I'm a firm believer that we still exist within the Westphalian state, and the Westphalian state is dominated by national interests. It's not in the interest of the United States to actually engage in these events if they can get what they can get. Iraq is a mistake, done by foolish policymakers. But I don't. If there's a way to coexist with Gaddafi, why not? Because ultimately, what can Gaddafi do? As long as he doesn't practice terrorism, as long as he's put in a box, why not?
He actually, yes.
He has his hand up there.
I know. He also, in that sense, I mean, Gaddafi, part of the post 9/11 policy shift was to provide all this information about Al-Qaeda. It was great.
Yes.
But that was up to the invasion of Iraq.
It wasn't
Yeah.
about the invasion. It was not about the invasion of Iraq. That's why I said it started under Clinton. The Libyans were knocking on the Americans' door under Clinton, and they didn't finish it. Martin Indyk writes about this. They didn't finish it. Bush came in, Condoleezza Rice and company said, we are not going to talk to those Libyans. And they cut it all off. On the morrow of September 11th, the Libyans said, you know who had the first Interpol warrant out for bin Laden? It was us. We know who these people are, and we can give you everything. And the CIA was meeting with them within 48 hours, and they told them what they knew, and that was it. It wasn't about Iraq. And then they had to manufacture a whole set of, you know, what are you going to do about the weapons of mass destruction and so forth and so on. It wasn't about Iraq. It was about the Libyans needing to get the kind of support the Algerians got against their Islamists from the rest of the world. And it was about the Americans not knowing anything about who these people were. So it's even funny because there was a remark that Gaddafi made during that period saying, you know what, most of the terrorists are in Europe. And everybody laughed and laughed, you know, what is he talking about? Well, in fact, where were most of the terrorists? I mean, it's really interesting. That whole period, it's worth looking at closely. It wasn't about Iraq at all. It was about domestic Libyan politics and their need to get out from under the sanctions in order to get regional and international support for their own trying to get rid of their Islamist opposition, which they knew were all... Remember when we used to talk about the Arab Afghans? All the people from the Arab world that fought in Afghanistan? Well, they were all over North Africa. They were in Algeria, but the Algerians had support from the United States, support from the French, so forth and so on, during their war in the 1990s. The Libyans had the same problem, mostly in Cyrenaica, and they didn't have any international support at all. And they realized that they were going to be just sucked into this forever if they couldn't get out. That was the background to the decision that they were going to try and get out from under the sanctions. And it was Saif al-Islam who thought of it.
And the billions that were paid for Robert.
Of course, they got out of it. But they all agree. But I mean, if you look at the literature, the Prime Minister, Shukri Khanum, Saif al-Islam, everybody said, we just paid to get out of this. We don't think we did it, but it doesn't matter. We paid billions to get out of it, but we had to. But finally, we had an American administration that was willing to let us pay the billions and get out. That's what they needed. So they got rid of what was claimed to be a weapons of mass destruction program. They paid the money on Lockerbie. They all said, this is a dog and pony show. They said, we're being hypocritical. It's the only way we can get out. And it worked. Now, did it leave a bad taste about the, fidelity to the rule of law and so forth in the international system? Well, probably. It still worked.
But the system will get over it.
What?
The system will get over it.
Exactly, sir.
In the very unfortunate event that there isn't any sort of peaceful transition of power, or it's short-lived, and there is some sort of civil unrest or even a civil war, who would the players be? Are there still major regional issues between Tripolitania and Cyrenaica? Are there tribal issues? Are there forces within the military that represent different factions? Who would the players be?
Yes, Cyrenaica and Tripolitania most probably. Fezzan will still be an outside player, I think, very much so. But actually it will indeed be between Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, because the Cyrenaicans think that they are being abused by the regime. And that
everybody thinks that.
But Cyrenaicans more than anything, because let me tell you, Cyrenaicans think that they're being abused for two reasons. First of all, they say the oil is from Cyrenaica. This is one. That's what they say. And the water is from Cyrenaica. And both those commodities are being pumped out of Cyrenaica, and yet nothing is being done in Cyrenaica. This is one. The other factor, too, which is more important, that Gaddafi has in fact been very harsh towards Cyrenaica because so much opposition is coming from Cyrenaica. And don't forget, again, what Dr. Ali said is quite right. It is a zero-sum game in his own eye. If you're not with me, you're against me. And Cyrenaica has been against him. The demonstrations have been, Cyrenaica has been against him. The attempted coups have been from Cyrenaica against him. And so he's been very harsh. And Cyrenaica, unfortunately, do not distinguish between Gaddafi and between Tripolitanians, anyone else.
Is that where also that there is more of an Islamist opposition in Cyrenaica, or is that
Well, I think it's true that we have in the eastern region, as Dr. El-Kikhia mentioned, a more sense of being really, neglected and overlooked and repressed. But I think the concerns now, cross other regions. The idea is now we are facing tremendous social and economic malaise, especially education, health as an institution are really in the worst situation, and also unemployment. We're talking about real life issues. So we're not talking about just when we're going to change the system. I don't think that's really, I think people are talking about daily alive activities and daily concerns, and the fact that over 1 million people, Libyans, go to Tunisia, they sell their jewelry and they go in debt to just be treated there. It shows you the magnitude of the problems that are now. Now, I think as far as the possibilities that we keep coming to it, which is, I think, the gist of your question here, the answer has to be qualified against certain forces. There is, of course, on the top, the leaders' children. There is the security apparatus. There's also the old guard. There is also the regional and tribal, forces that also have been a force as well, and the army marginalized, but also at the same, it has some saying in this. I think anybody who will tell you that there will be a concrete scenario, they will be misleading you. There are all these possibilities now, and right now the specter of civil war, I think that's removed from it. But it depends what will be done in the coming years to resolve these issues. And Saif al-Islam, even though it might be not really the solution, he vents and echoes a lot of concerns in the most Libyans are concerned about. So in a way, is as far as saying the things that people feel when they say Libya is a failure. We have our economy is a total disaster. Our experiment is over. We need to have a constitution. We have rule of law, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. We need to build the infrastructure. Most Libyans say, yes, this is exactly how we feel. Now, how to make that transition is not an easy, not because, of course, most people agree with that, but also we have to remember, it's not just this is really the problem. We have a complex situation where groups who have vested interests, and they are fighting to keep the status quo, and there are other groups who are fighting also about that change. So far, it's been peaceful, which is, I think, great for the vast majority of Libyans. Would that disintegrate into a violent one? I agree, this is a possibility. But so far, the specter of Somalia or something, I don't think it's there. It will be really misleading the situation.
If I may, again, and I come back to this issue why I think that what he's doing on colonialism is important. Unfortunately, rightly or wrongly, Cyrenaicaans have always seen themselves. It's very much like what the Holocaust is for the Jews. Because Cyrenaica has bore the brunt of that, they feel that something must be made up, that they were responsible for continuing the resistance. They continued the resistance until 1932, and others did not. No, rightly or wrongly, this is what the perception is. And I think this has constantly been a factor in their thinking. You're very right when he says 1 million people actually go to Tunisia, sell the jewelry so they can be treated. The same thing happens when you look at Cyrenaica that go to Jordan. In fact, in Jordan, hospices, special hospitals to treat Libyans, and people pay everything they have because of the lack of medical facilities within the country. Figures are wonderful figures. They really are. I look at figures, the World Bank book, the CIA book, the World Bank, wonderful figures about the GDP, $14,000 per capita, the GDP of $92 billion. But these are figures that bear no resemblance to the actual facts on the ground. The problem in Libya is that there is no infrastructure, that there are no hospitals to take care of people, that people don't have the funds to actually pay to heal themselves. The system is not capable of healing them. It's not capable of taking care of them. Okay. Saif al-Islam may talk as much as he wants, but the talking has to stop, and the acting must be shown. If he wants to stay in power. I'm sorry, I took over.
No.
Do you have any?
No, I don't. No.
We have come to the end of our session. I have certainly enjoyed myself. I want to thank the panelists, and I want to thank all of you. And Yusuf, I think this is going to have to be an annual affair. Thank you very much.